Good morning to you all. Good morning. So lovely of you to invite me to Shedding Baptist Church to talk about the work of Tek Ura. So firstly, I'd like to thank you all. My name is Andy. Denise, my wife, normally calls me Andrew, and my mother used to call me Andrew, of course. I'm Treasurer and Deacon of Forest Road Baptist Church. I'm the Deputy Chair of Tek Ura Council of Supporters. So we meet quite often. Anne joins us on Zoom, and we talk about what's going on. My talk today is more about my journey with Tek Ura when I first went out there many years ago. But I'd like to say firstly a very warm welcome from us all at Forest Road Baptist Church. It's lovely to be here, as I say. It's not that far away, as you know, I'm sure. It's a very small church. We're only about 18 members at Forest Road. No minister at the present time, but with a real heart for the Lord and a desire to spread the word through the community. But it's a very odd community in Forest Road. So I'll tell you at the outset, stand here does not come naturally to me, particularly when giving reflection. Although I've done so at our church a few times, and I do it prayerfully, and I spend a lot of time listening to God, and that's my forte. But I'll talk about the work of Tek Ura and how it's progressed over the years, and give you my Bible message a little later. That was a lovely video at the outset. I thought it was really sort of, to me, that sort of reflected some of the sort of Albania issues, like that everyone can come to God. Mm-hmm. And that's what they've brought out in Tek Ura. So they've developed their church. So I'll start with how Forest Road Baptist Church got started with Tek Ura. It was back in about 2015, 2016, when we decided as deacons that we would like to partner with missionaries abroad to give our church a better and closer understanding, so that we pray for some of the work that's being supported by BMS. We knew that those supporters, some of the specifics, more about specifics that we could pray for. There was a lot of interest in BMS at the time from the church family. So a few of us took a trip up to Didcot and had a chat with them. We were introduced to a lot of different places, and we brought it back to the church family, and we told them these are the different missionaries that we can partner with. We talked a lot about Africa and India, and of course we thought we want to partner with someone closer to home, someone in Europe, and that was quite an appeal, because you sometimes forget about Europe. We often talk about India and Africa and the work going on out there, but actually Albania, it was so close, and we said, well, let's do that. Dan and Annie had not long been in Albania when we first got in contact, and soon developed a relationship with them, and it was agreed in March 2016 that we would go out there as a church. So myself, Mary McLaughlin, you may know, who was our minister at the time, Jez Elwood, who's a fellow deacon, took a trip out and stayed with Dan and Annie in the early days, and that was a real revelation to see what was going on out there. So we got to know the team of in Tirana. I think absolutely amazing about the trip was the fact that Tek Ura team had premises in an odd area where people, including families with children, were living in shacks, tiny little shacks next to the river, with just one room, concrete floors, concrete walls, some with just wooden walls as doors, doors, and put doors together and build these shacks, which was extraordinary. Not proper roofing, tin roofing, a lot of them without roofs, leaking roofs, at times just water coming through. Children sleeping on the floor, extraordinary to see it, absolutely extraordinary. But these people had nothing, really nothing, and they were looking to develop a church in this area. That's quite extraordinary. When I look back at the visit, I'm not sure what I expected before I went out there. That's what's interesting. I went out there, didn't know what to expect. I'm not sure what Dan and Annie thought when they arrived with their family, but they've since mentioned they had given a sincere promise to God to love that community, to build a church, and they agreed to love Albania. But this small suburb on the outskirts of Tirana, known as Cafe Aramus, is notorious for conflict, rebellion, synonymous with Albanian gangs and traffickers. So well known in the UK here. We know about those gangs. They must have made them question whether they could love the place, but in view of their unconditional promise, love it they did, and believing faithfully that this was God's plan for them, knowing that so many people were praying for them and their work. So that video really just hit me. This is what it's about. This is what it's about. Their focus was on the Roman and Egyptian community, who were dismissed by the rest of the country as outcasts, completely ignored. If they could get jobs, there would have been sweatshops in factories. They were sweeping the streets, cleaning the toilets, selling rags on the roads that had been collected from the dumps. We look at some of the pictures. This is when we first went out there. This was the bridge, right? This is from the bridge, right? Extraordinary. They would live hand to mouth, picking up scraps from rubbish bins, and their children were not allowed in schools. It was a very odd community. Everyone in the area dumped their rubbish in this river. Okay, they would just chuck it over the bridge and put it. Whatever. You see the rubbish on the river, on the river banks. It was absolutely extraordinary. Rather than putting there were massive great dustbins just down the road. People from all round would just come to this bridge and dump it in the river here. It was very unpleasant, but the locals would just go and collect the rubbish, collect that plastic and things like that. I've got to tell you though, when I made my notes for this, right, I was sitting in my study. This is bizarre, right? Sitting in my study. I had a net curtain up at the window when I'm looking at, and I can't see much out because this net curtain, and Denise knows this, right, because I put this net curtain in. Bizarrely, this net curtain fell down when I was doing this notes, right, when I was writing these notes. It just fell down. And you looked out then, I could see the beauty of our land, right, the beauty. There's a beautiful hydrangea, pink hydrangea, that I was looking out at. And I just thought, that's God reminding me, really saying to me, right, how we live in such a beautiful place with these beautiful flowers. And I could see, right, I just thought, God's telling me the greyness of Tirana when I went there, the greyness, it was just grey. And rubbish was everywhere. And it's extraordinary how, and I've just felt God really saying to me, this is what you have. This is where you live, and this is what they have. And this is what we need to support. And then it reminded me of the colour that that Dan and Annie had brought to that place, and the life they brought to that place in introducing God. And that's wonderful. That's how wonderful it is. You know, these people are on the edge of suicide in their grey world, and we have this beauty of I know we have our struggles in this place, but we do have our beauty here. Tek Ura's meaning is the bridge. It was tasked with setting up the centre. Looks if we find the centre. Oh, we'll go back. We'll go backwards. That's the wrong button, I think. There we are. That was the centre. So this is when we first went out. That was the centre, and they hadn't sort of developed it in any way. It was, as I say, it was on the edge of the area where all these shacks were. And when we were there, it was interesting to see how people really did not want to engage with any of us, with Dan, Nanny, with anyone. They just didn't want to engage. They were suspicious of us. Why would anyone take an interest in them? You know, again, we have such a lovely environment. They really didn't have what we have. It took time for the team to develop those relationships, but they did get closer. We provided, when we were there, we provided a number of food bags to some of the local community, which was a real privilege. They were so grateful, but still suspicious of what we wanted. Were we wanting something back from them? As I say, the river was another source of rubbish for the locals to go and collect from, and they went and collect from the dumps. And they would sell this stuff for a pittance. A big bag, massive great bag of plastic they'd carry on their back, plastic bottles they picked up. They'd sell for about £1.50, and that would be what lasted them a day. And they would have to keep their children going on that and food. I mean, a lot of them were begging on the streets because the children weren't at school anyway. The river was eroding. That river that we saw earlier was eroding, eroding the banks along the sides, and some of those houses were just falling into the river. You know, some of the shacks were just falling into the river. Now the council did get engaged with that. The council would get engaged, and they actually would rehouse these people, but they put them into places that were like prisons. They just have a small room, and they couldn't get out. They weren't allowed out. These people just went into these places. They didn't like going in there, obviously. At least in these places, they could get out and go and collect and earn £1.50 a day. And around that time, we went and looked at. I mean, they were building these new places, okay, but they didn't. A lot of these were empty. A lot of these places were empty, and they were trying to sell them, but they didn't sell them for years, and they just remained empty. But they wouldn't use these for the locals at all. They would just keep hold of them empty. We learned an awful lot during our visit in Albania, and we continue supporting through prayer and financially over the next couple of years, whilst they continue to develop their church and different groups and locals for the local as they become more and more trusted. So locals, a lot of the locals, not necessarily Roma and Egyptian, all the locals were then invited in. I went back myself a couple of years later when the difference was huge, and for many the local community had pulled together as a church. With a men's group, a children's play group, teaching sessions, ladies groups, and people just getting together to chat. Wonderful, what a difference they made. They developed physio sessions that many would not get from their local health service, particularly for disabled children. They would train the parents to know how to do physio with their children, that they could then provide themselves. The staff they employed were mainly locals. I know that Yuri and Matilda started in October 2019, who are now running that place. Yuri became the pastor there and has done so. But he was from the local community himself, so he could relate to them and really pull them in. It's fabulous to see actually what they achieved in that short time. But we have to see God's work there. It's not Dan and Annie, it's God's work. God clearly wanted them to be there. He needed them to work, and he needed them there, and they did the work that he wanted. And I think that's where the cornerstone had been laid, and God developed the new way of life using Dan and Annie and the team to build upon it. Children were then getting into schools and people getting into jobs that had not happened previously. There were baptisms, regular Bible lessons, and well-attended church services. Lots to give thanks for. I felt quite jealous actually. Why could we not achieve that in Forest Row? Why is that? They achieved so much. They had loads of baptism. I thought, why can't I get this? But they had so much faith in God. It was not without challenges, I know, over the years, but Dan and Annie have always reflected on how faithful God has been throughout the different challenges. It includes individuals that struggled with their faith, but they've been those that have leading Albania gangs that have now been influenced and have turned to our Lord. That's wonderful. I mean, it's great. The team has transformed thousands of lives in that part of the world, and we've seen fewer people begging on the streets, living out of bins, more refugees are more supported and settled in Tirana rather than coming over here. That's what they're encouraging. Children from diverse backgrounds building positive relationships through sport. We've seen less older people and carers isolated and participating in community events. People being baptised. People working together and loving their community. People with learning difficulties getting out into the community. Children from low-income families being accepted into schools. Less girls being subjected to underage marriages. It's all led to less people looking to move to the UK. One of the things that I'd love to see is their holiday clubs, which they've run on a number of occasions, taking people from Tirana to the beach, and many of the older folk who have never seen the sea before. Their lives, let alone swim in it. Many have been baptised on these visits. At the time, when talking to Dan and Annie, they felt that Tek Ura had a lot of supporters like you, and they should provide regular updates to these churches. And so they set up this council of supporters, which is fabulous. They would provide them with the opportunity to get closer to the group, so they want to get closer to us all. and say how they're managed and how they're taking it forward. And of course, more recently, we've seen a second centre open in Durres. And there was the ability to purchase the land, which I know you've helped with, which is now progressing. But I could talk separate about that, because I felt very much that God was involved in the decision to take forward. I spoke to Dan a few times about this land. They were not going to proceed because they knew they were coming back here, Dan and Annie. But they prayed about it, and they felt that they had a clear message from God, which they then took to the trustees. And the trustees said, well, if that's what God is saying to you, you've got to go ahead with it. I say they weren't going to go ahead with it because they couldn't manage it themselves. But it's actually happening. They raised the money and sufficient funding for it through God. And thank you to all who've helped. I could go on and on, but I really wanted to go back to the beginning of this wonderful journey when the seed was sown by BMS in Tirana, by sending the debris out there, and now see the next stage when BMS have changed their strategy, and of course Tek Ura is run by locals. So we have the local team, they've got a big team out there, and Dan and Annie continue to manage from the UK. The cornerstone had been laid by God, and locals are managing themselves. We clearly have a big part to play in the wonderful future of Tek Ura, and that is continue to pray for Dan and Annie and their family as their lives are completely changed, but also for the team that are now managing Tirana and Durres. I can't leave without mentioning the different groups we have. We can, you can all go out there. They have this immersive event which happens regularly. They recently had 12 people from 7 churches who spent 5 days in Albania. Right, you're all welcome to go out on one of these sessions. So I can't go without mentioning that. Please look out for that. If you're interested in going out to visit the team, you can do so through this team. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening to me.